Zealous for God, John chapter 2. I believe when Gene read these verses from John chapter 2, it really wasn't something that you didn't already know about. Sometimes there are events in the life of Jesus that we're not nearly as acquainted with as we are this event. But you and I need to think about it, and that's really we're going to focus on that from John chapter 2. But look down especially at verse 17, because after all of this has transpired and how alarming it must have been to Jesus' disciples. We'll talk about that a little bit. But can you imagine all of a sudden Jesus is there in the temple and then all of a sudden He starts doing this? I wonder what those disciples that were there with Him thought about it. And by the way, I wonder what those who used to wear that bracelet, WWJD, what would Jesus do? Who depict by that just a loving Jesus that, that is kind and just as gentle as can be. I wonder what they would have thought if they had all of a sudden seen what transpired here and the disciples figured it out. Verse 17 says, "Then His disciples remembered that it was written, 'The zeal that I have for your house has eaten me up.'" I want you to think about that. Because not only is that characteristic of Jesus and motivated Him in this situation, but at the end of the lesson we're going to talk about us. What eats you up? You ever got something under your skin? It's just hanging there. Somebody says something, somebody's done something, and it just sits there and it just cooks and it's like a pan of water that's on the stove that's sort of warm, and then it gets really warm, and after a while it is just boiling over. My zeal for your house has consumed me. Amazing attribute of Jesus. But let's look at the background of this lesson. You may not be aware of the fact that Jesus cleansed the temple on more than one occasion. There are at least 2 times that Jesus cleansed the temple, and we're not sometimes aware of it. But He cleansed it in the first month of His ministry, then in His last week of His ministry. And I've got first months in quotes because I'm not even sure if it was a month. Does that make sense? Jesus makes His public appearance other than when He's 12 years of age, evidently at His baptism. And then He's in the wilderness for 40 days being tempted of the devil and overcoming the temptation the devil brought to Him. And then there is that miracle that He does in Cana of Galilee, where He turns the water into wine. And the very next event, John chapter 2 is the verses that Gene read to us. John chapter 2 says, it's the Passover. The Jews are gathered from all over the world. Josephus mentions a number, and it's an astronomical number. It's so immense. Josephus, a Jewish historian who lived in the 1st century, and mentions the fact that at one of the Passovers, there were nearly 2.5 million Jews in that city. I don't know if that's an accurate number or not, but Acts chapter 2 mentions on another feast day that there were devout men from every nation under heaven that had gathered there for that day of Pentecost. And so maybe 1 million, maybe as many as 2 million people are in the city, and there is the temple, the focus of it all. And Jesus walks inside the temple. And you know the story. The oxen and the sheep and the doves and the money changers and their tables and the whip. You know the story. When Jesus begins to appear publicly, and that's why we have the word month in quotations. It's not exactly a month, but His baptism, and then He fades out of the scene. He appears in Cana of Galilee, and the very next event, in the earliest part of the life, the first year, the first months of His public ministry, He's in there turning the tables over inside that temple. We've already said, Can you imagine what the thoughts were? Can you imagine what those disciples who had been disciples of John and were now followers of Jesus evidently, can you imagine what they felt? What have we bought into? Nobody ever told us we were going to be around a man who all of a sudden walks into this holy place and there are all of these things that are here and he causes such an immense matter of disruption of things. And then, in the last week of his life, and by that we mean the last week before his crucifixion, being raised from the dead, obviously that's not the last week of his life, but the last week before he died, this event happened again, and it is of such importance that not only does Matthew record it, Mark records it, and Luke records it. I think it's ironic that all it needs to be is recorded one time, but it is recorded by all three of the writers, and since John records that one in the first week, every one of the gospel writers, as they wrote their account of the life of Jesus, wanted everybody to see that there was a zeal in Jesus that motivated every part of his life. The zeal of thine house is eating me up, and I cannot just stand here and not be aware. I cannot just stand here and be indifferent toward it. Now, think about the description of the temple and the taxes and the sacrifices that were there. These Jews came from all over the world. Acts chapter 2 mentions some 13 or 14 nations that the Jews on the day of Pentecost had come from. And whenever they came there was a tax that must be paid, decreed in the Old Testament, but it was used in the New Testament, and it provided in many respects the monies for the operation of the temple. It was not a large amount of money. It amounted to about a day's wages. But the reality was that sometimes they would not take Jewish money for that temple tax, and so there were bankers, money changers. So I can take this money, if I'm from Cyrene in North Africa, the money that I have there, I can bring this money and turn it into Jewish money, and then I'll be able to, what's the interest on it? One account said it was twice what the tax was. You'd go in and you'd be ready to change your money, and you have to pay 3 times the amount of the worth of the money in order just to get the one amount that you needed. Well, what about these animals? Well, there are 2 or 3 ways to get the animals there. The animals were needed, and I think the original BYOB was found in there, and that is bring your own beast. One way of having the animal there for your sacrifice was to bring your own. But now, if I'm traveling 1,000 miles to get there, I'm not going to carry the beast. And so inside the temple, in one of the outer courts, in the Jewish temple in the first century, somewhat different from Solomon's temple, but there was an outer court called the court of the Gentiles. And out in that area, the outmost area, is still a part of the temple grounds itself. They had all of these animals. It's interesting that there is secular history that says this, and the words of Jesus sort of indicates they might have been just about right. Secular history says that outside of the temple you could buy those animals and for your use to sacrifice your animals. But there was a chief inspector of animals. There was a animal inspector, and if you brought in your animal and it did not measure up to the quality of the temple, that the animal that was needed in the temple, he would deny the use of that animal, and he'd put it in a special pen, and you'd have to buy a certified temple animal. Now you imagine, your heart is broken because of sin. And you've arrived there at the temple, and you have that lamb that is going to be your part of your sacrifice, and you've brought it with you. And the priest who is there says, that animal's got a flaw in it. You've got to bring a perfect animal, and we're not going to let you have this animal. You cannot use this. But we have these animals over here for sale, and we're running a special on lambs today. And he puts your lamb in a pen. Listen. And as you walk away, you see your lamb being taken and put in the pen to be sold to somebody else. I don't know if that happened. Secular history indicates it could have happened and perhaps did happen. And Jesus walks into that place, and he gets so upset that this picture of Jesus and what would Jesus do of him being mild and meek and kind and gentle flips upside down. There's something churning inside of him. And that is, I just cannot afford to let this happen. You and I need to have that realization, for because you see, that temple was a holy place. It was a holy place because when the prelude to the temple, the tabernacle made of skins that they made when they were in the land of Egypt, Exodus chapter 40 verse 34 says that whenever they had erected that tabernacle out there in the wilderness at Mount Sinai, that all of a sudden the glory of God came and descended on that temple, on that tabernacle, and it so filled the tabernacle up that no man could even get inside of it, a manifestation of the glory of God. And then later in 1 Kings chapter 8, when Solomon builds his temple, the very same thing happens. When Solomon dedicates that temple in Jerusalem, several hundred years later, the very same thing happens. There's a manifestation of the glory of God and the cloud and the smoke that came down, and it filled up the temple so that nobody could get in or out of the temple. To get into the temple, nobody was in there when it happened. God was in that place. But His holiness was hidden. His glory was hidden. The furniture in that back room where there was the Ark of the Covenant had within it the tables of stones at the covenant. That's why it was called the container of the covenant, the Ark of the Covenant. There was a pot of manna there at one time, and Aaron's rod that budded inside that. But on top of that box that had the Ten Commandments, there was a gold slab, and it was called the mercy seat. The location, the seat of mercy, the throne of mercy. This is where mercy is found. And on top of that Ark of the Covenant, there were cherubims. And their wings overshadowed the center of that area. And on that Day of Atonement, the priest would go in with the blood of the animals and would sprinkle that blood there. And the rabbis say that because that back room had no light within it, the front room had that golden candlestick with the 7 bowls of oil that burned in that front room, no light in the back room. And the rabbis say that on that day there was a brilliant light that shone. And they call that light the Shekinah. That's a Hebrew word. And that word means glory. And whether that light was there or not is immaterial, for the Bible does say that the glory of God was in that place. But it was hidden from people, because before they ever moved nobody was allowed in that back room where the Shekinah was. And only certain priests were allowed to ever go back there. When it was a tabernacle, they covered it up with a blue cloth, and nobody ever saw that the golden cherubims that were there. Nobody ever saw that place where the glory of God was. And only that priest, one day of the year, only the high priest, he was the only one who ever got to go back in that back room, and the glory of God was there, and God met them there. And how holy that day must have been. Because you see, only that priest who had first cleansed himself and offered sacrifice for his own sins, only then was he allowed to go back into that room. Unholy men were not allowed to see the sacredness of that which was there. Listen, it was a treasure. Now, Solomon's temple was overlaid with gold. Those walls in Solomon's temple were some 60 feet high, at least, covered with gold. Treasury. Listen, the treasury was not in that gold. It was in the glory of God. And when Jesus walked into that temple, He was upset not because of the waste of the animals that was there, that was spilled perhaps all over the floor of the tabernacle, that courtyard outside. He's not upset because the gold has been desecrated. There's something else inside of Jesus that was stirred, that caused Him to react the way that He did. See, you and I need to understand that which is proclaimed holy by God can be desecrated. It can be profaned, is the Bible word. We mentioned before of when the tabernacle was built, and then later when the temple was built, the glory of God, the Shekinah of God came down into that place. In the visions of Ezekiel, Ezekiel sees God's presence, sees the glory of God, the Shekinah of God, leaving that temple. And if we had more time, we'd look at Ezekiel chapter 8 and verse 4, and chapter 9 and verse 3, and chapter 11 and verse 22, and chapter 11 and verse 23, where Ezekiel sees that glory of God, and he sees it coming up from where the cherubims are. It comes over to the door of the tabernacle, to the temple, the exit door. He then sees the Shekinah of God as it lifts itself above the temple itself, and it goes over to the Mount of Olives. And the glory of God departed from that temple in a vision that Ezekiel saw, because unholy men had no respect for that which was sacred. And you need to understand that we beheld His glory. The Word was made flesh and dwelt among us, and we beheld His glory, the glory of as the only begotten of the Father, full of grace and truth. And when the glory of God, with a capital G, walked inside that temple, and He saw what had happened, and the profanity that was there, and the disregard for everything that was sacred there, the glory of God, listen to this, He walked outside of that temple. He went outside the threshold. He went to the Mount of Olives, and then He ascended into heaven. And He said to those people, right before He said, not one stone of this temple will be left upon another, He said, your house is desolate because the glory of God is no longer there. I wish we had time to look at Ezekiel 43, where Ezekiel sees another vision of the coming of the church. In Ezekiel chapter 43, verse 4, especially, in a vision that Ezekiel sees of the church, the glory of God comes back to the church. Spend just a few minutes looking at the reaction to Jesus to all of these things. His actions. We've already mentioned those sheep and those oxen and those doves that were there. By the way, He didn't release the doves. He told the men who had the doves in whatever cages, you carry these out. Then He made a whip. Having turned over the tables of the money changers and scattered their money all over the floor, He makes a whip, and the Bible says, and He drove them all out with the sheep and the oxen. At one time, as I'd read that verse, I thought, well, He probably used that whip like a cowboy would use his whip, some way to herd the animals. No. He drove them all out with the sheep. What would Jesus do? Mild, kind, gentle spirit Jesus, with a whip in his hand, says, "Get out of this place." It's interesting the words that he uses. He says in John, "Take these things away. Do not make my Father's house a house of merchandise." A little bit phraseology is different. We emphasize something different in each of these. When he was 12 years of age in that same building, he says, "Do you not know that I must be about my Father's business?" And now at about 30 years of age, he's inside that temple and he says, "This is my Father's house." Don't you dare profane. Don't you turn it into a place of that which is secular. Don't make it a place for merchandise. In Matthew's account of the later cleansing of the temple, Matthew says, he said it this way, "My house shall be called a house of prayer, but you've made it a den of thieves." The temple was not built, nor did Christ die, so that men might, at the expense of heaven's gifts to mankind, rob people. When I say that, are you thinking what I'm thinking? At the expense of poor people, people who don't have a whole lot of money. And in the name of Jesus, for televangelists to get on and say, "I need your money. Don't make your mortgage payment." I heard a guy say this within the last year. "Don't make your mortgage payment, send the money to me." Christ died not so men might be wealthy. Peter and John walked into the temple, and where there's that poor man asking alms of them, Peter and John says, "Silver and gold have I none, but such as I have give I thee." And in the name of Jesus, across this land today, in buildings all across this land, there are men whose life oftentimes are characterized by immorality and ungodliness. And there are televangelists who are saying, "Silver and gold have I none, but such as I have, send to me." Credit cards are accepted. And when Jesus saw what you and I see, something happened inside of him, and something started boiling inside of him, and it's eating me up. I've got to do something about this. This is a house of prayer, he says. It's where men who are broken bring broken hearts to the great physician. It's not a place where brokers make poor people broke. And something happened inside of him. It's a house of prayer. I wish we had more time to talk about Jesus' statement in Mark's account, where Mark says it's a house of prayer for all nations. We have bought into the perverted view that God never intended for Gentiles to be a part of that temple worship. Go back to 1 Kings chapter 8 and the same the parallel account in 2 Chronicles. And Solomon, when he dedicated that temple, said that God will hear, or the people of the land, even foreigners, even those who are not Jews, will hear of the glory of God, and they will come and they will worship in this house. And when they come and worship in this house, then God hear from heaven. But the racial prejudice of the Jews toward the Gentiles had put a plaque inside the temple that Herod had built that said, any Gentile that goes beyond this point will face instant death. Jesus himself said to the Jews of the first century, you don't understand what this temple is all about. It's not just a house of prayer for Israel, it is a house of prayer for all nations. And finally, you've made it a den of thieves. There's reasons for doing all this. Because he saw the value of the temple. Because he shared the values of the temple that God had. And he was zealous for God's cause. And it was God's cause that he wanted to defend. And the application of the lesson? God still has a temple. The Bible describes the church as the habitation of God through the Spirit. God had said in the Old Testament, I'll walk among them. I will be their God, and they will be my people. I will be their father, and they will be my sons, and I will walk in their midst. And he's describing the church. And listen, when we say church, I'm not talking about a building. I'm not talking about words on a piece of paper that describe some organization. I'm not talking about a name on a piece of advertisement that talks about the times of services when the church meets. I want you to know that God saw one day there would be another temple. And that's the latter vision of Ezekiel whenever he sees the temple of God, the habitation of God, the place where God dwells. And he saw people. And if you really are the church of Christ, then God walks in your midst. How much do you value the church? How secular has your life become? Are you one of the living stones, a part of that holy temple, that sacred spiritual temple of God? How secular are you? Merchandise or spirituality? And a brother or sister is in need. A part of the body hurts. Can I say it the way we said it last week? A member of the family is in need. What value do you have? But we can profane ourselves. We can profane ourselves as a collective body. We can profane our own part of our own life. And the real question that needs to be asked, when the holy church of God is profaned, when in the name of Jesus everything is done in this land, when sometimes even in churches of Christ, there are those who understand the Bible and understand a concept that the world does not have. And that is, instead of just being a part of a church that has earthly headquarters and secular identification and secular structure, to be a part of the family of God, and the headquarters is in heaven. And we're just the body of Jesus, a group of people that come together, not to secularize the church, but sometimes it is profaned. What are your actions? What are your actions? And what are your words? We said in that sermon last week, the word they needs to become we. Do you know what they are doing down at church? No. 1,000 times no. It's not they. It's the we. It's us. And for me to sanctimoniously pull myself back and talk about they without understanding that I'm a part of that very temple of God, living stones that build up the temple of God, and that we're all in this together. And my actions need to say, this is what really is important. And my words need to be there to defend the cause of righteousness. In a world that in immorality is headed to hell in a handbasket, Christians sit mute when homosexuality, sex outside of marriage and living together before marriage, Christians sit mute. And some are even entertained by the words of blasphemy of that which is sacred. Here's what I'm saying. Let's be like Jesus. If the church really was established by Jesus before He left His earth, and it became the habitation of God, whenever we see that which is wrong, or when we hear others blaspheming the sacred name of God, may there stir within us a zeal for righteousness. May we embrace God's values of the church and say, those are my values. And may we be courageous enough to defend. And may there be within us that which burns inside of us and boils inside of us. In a practical level, a gospel meeting just 2 weeks away, where the redeemed body of the people of God are doing everything they can to bring in visitors and outsiders to hear the gospel. And some of you already have plans not to come. Will you rethink that? Will you not let the zeal that you have for righteousness be like the zeal of Jesus that will burn inside of you and you cannot rest because of the treasure of the temple of God, the family of God? Our reasons? Because we have the treasure. And we are the treasure. And the world needs the treasure that we have to give to the world. God help us to have more zeal for righteousness. I hope you want to be a part of the temple. I want you to treasure the temple, see the value of it. Do you believe in Jesus? If you believe in Him, make up your mind, I'm going to become a part of this. That's repentance. And Jesus said, except you repent, you'll perish. And when you've confessed your faith, just like we've heard in recent meetings, this very day you confess your faith in Jesus and be baptized for the remission of sins, and you will become a part of that which God planned from the creation of the world to be a part of His holy temple, the church. But if you've wandered away and you need to come home, claim the treasure again. How can we help you go to heaven? Won't you let it be known by coming to the front right now as together we stand and sing? Will you come?